for joining us for this latest webinar on Street Child's work in response to the COVID-19 crisis. For those of you that don't know, my name is Tom Dannatt. I'm the Chief Exec and also the founder of the charity Street Child. And we're joined this lunchtime by Pete Garratt, who is Executive Director for our programs and people, Megan Lees-McCowan, who heads all of our work in Africa, and Payman Shamsian, who fronts all of our work in Afghanistan. And they will give their own perspectives on the crisis and Street Child's work in the crisis, with a 5 to 10 minute presentation each. And that should take us towards the probably just past the half-hour mark, which will leave 20 or 30 minutes for questions. And please do engage with us and put forward your points of view and ask your questions. So without further ado, I believe we're handing to Pete first of all. Pete, I'm going to pass to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and hello, everybody. Great to have you with us today. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm just going to start off with a couple of slides. It's now been 6 months since we launched our COVID-19 response appeal, and we're so amazed at the generosity of our supporters that have enabled us to achieve what we think are remarkable results for an organisation of our size. Of course, we couldn't do that without the more than 50 local partners whom we have supported and worked side by side in the field in order to get these results together. So basically, over 5.5 million people reached with information and services that have meaningfully increased their protection from the impact of COVID. And that's a quite phenomenal figure. And that was our initial focus in this response, to do what we could do to work alongside local organisations to utilise their incredible community-centred reach to help vulnerable, marginalised communities in the 14 countries in Africa and Asia where we work, to do what they could to protect themselves. And that's what we've seen. That's been through prevention messaging. That's been through helping reinforce the right kind of behaviours to limit the spread, limit the impact of COVID. And that's been through, some of the simple things like helping communities to have access to hand washing facilities so that they can, practice the kind of hygiene behaviours that we know do have an impact on reducing the spread and the impact of COVID. But in essence, what we really want to do today is to focus on where we've gone in the last 3 months of the response, because although the health impact is bad and is significant, and everybody affected by this terrible disease has a personal story of what's happened to them, and sadly where people have lost their lives, that impact has been felt far and wide. But what we're seeing in the countries where we work is an incredible humanitarian impact on families, and what we're seeing is that economic impact is tipping over the edge. Children and families that were sort of teetering on the edge of being able to sustain themselves have now been set back, and those most marginalised and vulnerable children and families have been set even further back. So in particular, we conducted a rapid needs assessment, which we've profiled before, and you can find it on our blogs on our website. You can read more details about that. But what that told us back in May was that we needed to pivot to ensure that particularly vulnerable children had access to protection services. And we'll say a little bit more about that as we give some examples through Megan. And it told us that we had to really double down on focusing on helping children to access education in a variety of different ways. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And that we needed to work alongside families to help them bounce back where possible from the impact of what they were going through economically, and just to even survive until a future point could come where they could themselves stand again. And we did that through a variety of ways, using livelihood support, cash grants, temporary emergency food support. And some of the numbers you can see on your screen reflect that reach that we've had. So this is real deep quality working alongside children in their communities and the families around those children in these communities to provide assistance. The graphs just kind of show a little bit some of the nature of some of the protection services that we've been providing. A lot of it has focused on making sure the right information is getting to the right people about how they can access the referral services that there are in their communities and in their countries. But specifically where it's been needed with the most vulnerable, we have provided and facilitated the provision of counselling and other forms of psychosocial support, and indeed make sure that individual children who have needed a what we call a case management approach, a dedicated individual approach to their situation, that they've got that support. If we go on to the next slide, what we're doing here is just illustrating the back to school nature of the different contexts where we work. And in common with the United Kingdom or Europe, where schools have begun to reopen, we've seen that in a number of our countries, typically in September in Afghanistan, beginning to reopen up now in October in some of our African countries. But still, as you'll see on the right-hand side, no date set for reopening in a number of countries: Bangladesh, Kenya, Liberia, Mozambique, Nepal, Rwanda, and Uganda. And that's deeply worrying. The UNESCO, the United Nations education body, has estimated that 1.6 billion children who would otherwise be in school are not. And reports are estimating that at least 10 million, and we think that's probably a conservative number, at least 10 million children will never go back to school again, who were previously having some kind of access to education, will never go back to school again. And so I think, what that reminds us is what an incredible challenge, we have got on our hands to help out of school children who are already out of school, get that chance to get education support, to have access to education. And those children who were in school but are now falling away, to help them get back in. And we've done that through a variety of mechanisms. I know in Sierra Leone, we've helped 4,000 children with catch-up school classes to get back up into school because they had exams coming up that were really important for their future life prospects. So just great to be able to support them in a very meaningful way. A lot of our education has revolved around providing paper-based activity learning packs. So 35,000 children in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in Uganda have been supported in that way, given home-based education activity learning packs so that they could keep doing something at home that would help them. And of course, where it's possible, we've helped ensure that particularly vulnerable communities know how they can access radio school learning programs in their areas, pre-recorded resources. In Sri Lanka, we were able to give very targeted USB, so digital-based solutions where digital options were possible. But we know the vast majority of the children we work with, it's the most simple approach that it has to be in terms of paper and pencil approach. And that has been a major focus of ours. I'm now just going to hand over to Megan, just to bring a little bit more flavour about some of the key lessons that came out of our rapid needs assessment that have guided this sort of much deeper quality approach.
Pete. So I want to take you first to Nigeria, which is Street Child's biggest programme in Africa, where we've been working in the conflict-affected northeast, where the Boko Haram Islamist insurgency has displaced millions and forced millions of children out of school. So prior to COVID-19, Street Child and R5 partners were supporting over 40,000 children to go to school, some after many years of disruption, some for the very first time. And we were providing protection services like alternative care placements for orphans and separated children, family mediation for children forced into armed groups who'd escaped Boko Haram. But when COVID-19 hit, all of this stopped and services were down, and children were once again out of school and without access to the social services that we have been able to provide. So, you know, the last 6 months, we and our partners have been really focused on getting those services back up and running in whatever form we're able. As Pete has outlined, we've been looking at remote options in many cases. So providing school materials remotely, paper-based or digital where that's possible, and small group learning. But as well as resuming those services and looking forward to the reopening of school that we expect in the next couple of months, we've had to look again at our new landscape, something I think we're all doing, we're all reflecting on, the new post-COVID-19 landscape, and the new landscape in particular of needs. After all these lockdowns and business shutdowns that have been going on over the past 6 months, one example I want to share with you is of a particularly vulnerable group of children we've identified. And so this group of children, the Al-Majiri, was highlighted to us in particular by one of our local partners, ACRI, who've been working with this group of children for a long time. Al-Majiri are itinerant street children, boys in the main, under the supervision of an Islamic leader, or Malam. There are millions of children, of these street-connected children across the Northeast. And our rapid needs assessment discovered that this group of children, based on the street, had next to no knowledge of COVID-19, unlike the population at large, who had been reached by government broadcasts, by our own door-to-door services. Al-Majiri children had really been left out. And so were highly vulnerable to the effects of COVID-19, to hunger and illness from being in constant street situations, and were being hit very hard by the lockdowns. And I should say as well that Al-Majiri children are and have always been highly vulnerable to recruitment by armed groups such as Boko Haram. With weak family support systems, far from home and lacking money and food, they're easy fodder for the Boko Haram insurgents who continue to operate in the Northeast. So one of the things we did straight after the rapid needs assessment was launch a project with ACRI, with our partner ACRI, for 2,000 Al-Majiri children to provide food during periods of lockdown, basic hygiene kits to support prevention of the spread of COVID-19, as well as wider awareness campaigns to really draw attention to their specific plight in the domestic setting in Northeast Nigeria. So we hope that's just the start, and we're starting to see as well more and more interest from our platform promotion and others getting involved nationally in this issue of Al-Majiri to really shine a spotlight on this extremely vulnerable group of children. And what I think this example really highlights is a focus of Street Child working specifically in the coming months and likely years with unreached and unsupported groups. We won't be able to do it all. We'll have to resume the services that we provide for the conflict-affected children we're already working with. But COVID-19 has revealed a new vulnerability, and that's what Street Child will be focusing on in Nigeria in the coming months. So then moving over to Uganda, a different context, where we're doing work both in refugee settings with South Sudanese refugees in the north and Congolese refugees in the west, as well as work in some rural and highly undeveloped settings across the country. We've mainly been doing work in education in Uganda, including through our Build Africa and Lessons for Life merger heritage. We're now working across the country. The shutdown in Uganda was particularly extreme, even if I think of comparison to Nigeria, where some movement was still possible. Uganda really brought down the shutters. No movement was allowed for months, and contravention of the rules was quite highly punished, and there was some news stories as well about the involvement of the police and the military in enforcing that. So really very strict, and services came to a complete standstill. And their airport is still not open. So within those constraints, we had to work hard to gain all the permissions to be seen as an actor that could still move during that time and meet the needs of the most vulnerable communities we were still trying to serve. And we also moved to remote services in education, in particular, leveraging government resources, but also creating complementary, accessible resources of our own, because a lot of the government materials were aimed very high and not appropriate for pre-literate or just literate children that we were working with. But again, what we really found through the rapid needs assessment, but also through the time that we were able to spend in the field once we were allowed to move again, was that there's a huge rise in protection issues going on, in particular in the refugee camps, but not limited to the refugee camps. This very strict lockdown, forcing everyone to stay at home, children, people who would normally be at work, bringing down incomes, causing domestic tensions, and really putting a squeeze on family finances, had led to a big increase in reports of domestic violence and child abuse. So, having been principally an education responder in Uganda, with some protection work, we realized we really had to beef up our protection response. We had to make our social workers and services available to as many of the communities we were working in as possible to actually help these children and victims of domestic violence to escape those situations if necessary, or to receive mediation, counselling, and be referred to services such as rape counselling, for example, where that was needed, because there was a real absence of these protection services in the places we were working. So here you've got our social workers going out. They've just gotten bikes. That's been the main way that they've been able to get out and around the communities, because there's no public transport available to actually deal with the protection issues that have been raised in the community. And I think this has really laid the groundwork for a future direction for Street Child of Uganda that hitherto had not been sort of a top priority, and that's to really provide child protection services, a more comprehensive protection project, which ensures our children have access to a safe adult and specific support available where needed. So that's what COVID-19 has really showed us in Uganda. And then finally, a word on Mozambique. And I bring this example to attention not so much to highlight the impact of COVID-19, but to showcase a place where COVID is several rungs down on the list of concerns, but threatens to really exacerbate an already acute crisis situation. So northern Mozambique is experiencing an Islamic insurgency at the moment. It echoes in some ways the start of the Boko Haram crisis in northeast Nigeria. And this comes hot on the heels of two cyclones last year, which wreaked devastation on the northern part of the country, on schools, housing, public infrastructure. So on top of that, the conflict has displaced hundreds of thousands of people just in the last 6 months during the period of the COVID pandemic. And refugees are just flooding into neighbouring regions. So prior to COVID-19, we'd been working with partners, Kulima and Progresso, two of our local partners, on cyclone rebuilding efforts in schools. But since COVID hit, we've really started to pivot towards working with those conflict-affected people, because they had just been crowding into the province we were working in Cabo Delgado, which is up on the border with Tanzania. And they come with nothing, not even soap in many cases. And actually, in Cabo Delgado, rates of COVID-19 transmission, whilst still low, are the highest in the country. So looking forward, we have to really focus our attentions on these children and these families in Mozambique fleeing conflict, who risk, in the face of a global pandemic, being neglected and their basic human needs not provided for. And I think I just want to finish my section with a reflection that for Street Child and partners in Africa, The biggest problem with COVID-19, as ever, is that COVID-19 is not the biggest problem. There are so many crises and vulnerable situations that pre-existed COVID. And when you add COVID-19 on top of that, that's when the needs become really acute, and that's when our services are really needed the most. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Megan. Now, I'm going to move across from Africa to Afghanistan, and Payman is going to talk us through Street Child's work in Afghanistan in the last 6 months.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Megan and Pete. So yeah, I try to be as brief as possible, and I would focus on 3 aspects of our work in Afghanistan. I don't want to go into the details for the activities that we have done. Yeah, of course, like many NGOs, they provided hygiene kits, awareness raising, and other things that we did in Afghanistan. We were not an exception about these activities. But I want to highlight 3 aspects of our program, which was kind of new for us because of COVID. The first thing was providing mental health services for people, especially children. Right in the beginning of the pandemic, one of the things that we realized was people would suffer from lack of mental health services massively during the lockdown, and the pressure that you have because of the community, because of the social stigma. If you get sick, people would behave or treat you like in a very bad way, or like many other problems that you would have. So one of the focuses that we put on our programs in Afghanistan across all the operations we had in different provinces was providing MHPSs for children and families and communities. And to do so, one of the things that we did was like raising awareness basically for providing MHPSs, because there is this resentment in some of the communities towards mental health, because they consider someone who is receiving mental health services as someone who is crazy or who is not in the right mind. So that was like one of the things that we did. The other focus was, as Megan rightly mentioned, was identifying new vulnerabilities among the communities and individuals that we are dealing with. So, for example, one of the things that we realized that in some of the provinces in Afghanistan was giving a focus on those children who were getting released from juvenile rehabilitation centers. And these children wouldn't get any support from any other organization in Afghanistan, because they're not the usual code-by-code suspects. They're not an IDP, returnee, or like migrants, or like many other categories that we have. So we started to do advocacy for that, and we started to provide COVID-19 related services through our partners and directly to children who were recently released from juvenile rehabilitation centers, or those who were released from women prison, who were stranded in prison with their mother. The other part of like the COVID-19 response in Afghanistan was about that's one of the learning lessons that we had in Afghanistan, was about communication with communities. For communication with communities and awareness raising is always like organizations, they have a message and they go to the community and try to communicate that message to individuals. And we know, like, for example, for child marriage, we know child marriage is bad. So we know the message, we go to the community and communicate that with individuals, families. For COVID-19, we didn't know what is good and what is bad. We didn't know if wearing a mask is a good thing, and if tomorrow or like in 1 week, WHO would instruct us like differently. So what we started to do, instead of going to the community and individuals and giving them like a leaflet and telling them that, hey, you should do this, and then next week going and say that, hey, sorry, you shouldn't do this. We started to educate the communities to get familiar with the sources and go directly to WHO, go directly to other sources like TV, radio, maybe some community leaders, doctors who were like kind of familiar with the whole situation and would get updates, to get their updates from reliable sources. So it wouldn't be like only us going to the community and just giving them a message and then the next day or next week contradict our message. It would be the family itself being activating community-based mechanisms to protect themselves from COVID-19 situation in terms of health, in terms of mental health, in terms of economic hardship. So they were like all the things that they started to learn during the project. One of the projects actually we had in 4 provinces to start to take care of themselves, even like after the end of the project that we had in Afghanistan. So in general, what we tried to do was to be a bit more innovative in delivering services to the communities, alongside with all the traditional services of like hand washing stations, learning kits for out of school children, which is like a very massive issue in Afghanistan these days. And of course, hygiene kits, regular awareness raisings through radio, TV messages. We made a few animation clips with local languages. We try to be innovative when it comes to something that we don't know that much about it as well, and provide services that communities and people would benefit to the maximum. Thanks, Tom and Pete.
Payman, thank you so much. 3 fantastic presentations. I'd like to encourage everyone to start thinking about the questions that they want to put forward. A chat facility is the way that you deliver these questions to me. And just while people are readying their own questions, I could make many reflections, but I'll just limit myself to 1 or 2. The main reflection I want to make is with regards to Street Child's partnership approach, and to an extent a reflection on Street Child's very significant global growth in the last 6 years since I was last worrying about a global health crisis, and that was in 2014-15 when the Ebola crisis hit Sierra Leone and Liberia, which at that time were the only countries that Street Child was working in. And as many of you know, we mounted a deep and vigorous response. We learned a lot, and those lessons have very much informed the way that we've conducted our response to COVID, not least the attention we put on sensitization and awareness raising in those first 2 months of the appeal in particular. But what I want to reflect on is the decision we made after Ebola to explore the possibility of expanding our reach and our impact into other situations. And Street Child is now active in different ways in nearly 20 different countries around the world and in our COVID response. And should we have done that? You know, there is. I am regularly questioned about this. Should we stay focused on these geographies that we know, and really become expert in that and concentrate resources in that? And as I listen to Payman and Megan and Pete there, and I reflect on our wider response, I'm really encouraged that we have taken the right path in seeking to expand our footprint globally. And that's because of the way that we've done that. What's successful about Street Child in Ebola and in our first 4 or 5 years of operation was the way that we rooted our actions in the ideas and the initiatives that our grassroots staff were, and our partners' staff were feeding through to us. And then what we tried to do is we've expanded into other countries, Nepal, Nigeria, and then much further afield, is we've tried to retain that same approach whilst also building a greater body of connection and plug-in with the global expertise. And what I have seen play out over the course of our COVID response has been a very smart intersection between the particular needs of the communities we're working in, which have been brought to us by our partner organizations, by these 50 plus local organizations who we have involved in our COVID response. And then, whilst they have their specific contexts, of course, the broad issues which are coming up are very familiar. The need for remote learning solutions, the mental health issues, the type of protection issues, the points you've heard the other panelists discussing. And so at a global level, we have crafted broad tools and responses. And so we've been able to benefit from thinking on a scale there. And then at a local level, we'll be able to bring those to bear. And I don't know if I'm getting my point across clearly enough, but I believe that we have helped organizations. One of the smartest points of our overall COVID response is the way we have meaningfully provided support to grassroots local organizations who haven't had to work these problems out for themselves and actually be able to access globally designed expert solutions and then roll them out with funding in their own context and make a difference in those contexts. And that to me is something that is really exciting. Questions are starting to come in, and so now I'll move to your questions. The three ones here I'm going to pick out, and I'll read all three out, and then panelists pick the one you want to highlight on, or not at all three. Firstly, where do we see the focus of the response going over the next 6 months? Obvious and key question. Secondly, I just spent some time talking about the benefits of working with partners. And this question asks, what is the challenge, the largest challenge of working with local partners? And that is a serious consideration. And then this third question here is asking, are the temporary learning solutions currently being used, potentially a long-term solution for schools that don't open in the next few months? Those are the three questions to start us off. Fastest on the buzzer.
Hey Tom, I'm happy to take the sort of the next 6 months, and I think indeed beyond. Our reflections are internally we've used the words more than ever. It just feels like what COVID is doing is setting back quite dramatically a lot of good progress that has been made, and exacerbating the fault lines that we already see with vulnerable children, marginalised communities, not getting their rights, not getting access to basic services that you and I take for granted. So we see that more than ever will that our support and the support of our incredible local partner organisations be needed. So we're expecting a really big focus on education, on allowing and enabling out-of-school children to get into school or to get back to school. That is going to be a really big focus for us, along with ensuring that they can do so in a safe way, that children are protected. I mean, it's quite staggering to think about the increase in early child marriage that is already spiked this year as economic pressures puts families under pressure. And, you know, so often one of the easy options is to marry off young daughters, sadly, or you know, put young children into various forms of child labour, and we are seeing that spike significantly. So, you know, we've got a big role to play in those two areas in particular, and so I think we're going to see a lot more focus. Our existing work, we are adapting to be able to sort of face the particular challenges of COVID and its exacerbations that I talk about. Our work with the Musahar caste community in Nepal, for instance, I think is a great example, a truly innovative education and livelihoods program targeting young girls in a community where 96% of women and children are already illiterate. 99% are landless. You know, the lowest of the low in terms of caste communities. You know, we've got a long-term generational change program working with 10,000 young girls there, and what we've been able to do is build into that adaptation that allows it to continue to flourish, to really ensure that child protection mechanisms are well understood. We've had anecdotes of young girls in our program being able to prevent themselves being married off into frighteningly young child marriage. And, you know, in the office here, the virtual office, that was a real point of celebration when we began to hear those stories. Horrified that it was needed, but pleased that the program was enabling girls to reach out and stop those marriages taking place. So, you know, I think that's just a little example of, you know, we're adapting our work to face the context, but more than ever, our support, the support of you know, our partners, both at home in the UK and other countries around the world that enable us to do this work, and the work of our partners on the ground and in these communities, it's going to be needed more than ever. So it's not really a next 6 months. I think this is, you know, in a sense, the new normal, because the terrifying impact of COVID, what it's done to tip vulnerable families and communities over the edge, that's going to be felt for years. So, yeah, I feel like we've got a big journey ahead of us, but we're excited about doing everything we can as Street Child to support our local organisations to do everything they can.
Pete, thank you. Megan, Payman, anything you want to add to Pete there?
No, I don't think so on that question, but I'm happy to take the one about temporary learning solutions, thinking that Payman probably can share some thoughts on local partner challenges. And I think on that, I just want to say temporary learning solutions, to my mind, are no substitute for school. And our big focus over the next few months is getting children back to school where at all possible. The temporary learning solutions have been developed to maintain children's engagement in that time period, and if at all possible, to help them learn. But there are so many constraints to helping children learn in that way. I think a couple of the panelists have touched on them, you know, the lack of the most basic remote access to phones, internet, etc. I mean, or even radios, frankly, and in many of the rural communities we work in, just means that school is where children need to be, and that is our big focus. That said, a lot of the temporary learning solutions we've developed with a mind to helping schools build their resilience. So once children are back in the classroom, it is possible that schools will close again and reopen, especially if we see localized lockdowns or big spikes in COVID or changes in government policy. So once children have become familiar with these temporary learning solutions, and schools can draw on some of those materials as well, then they are at least at the children's disposal when schools may close again, to help deal with that disruption in a way that schools were just not prepared for when COVID-19 hit in March, and children were not prepared for. So yeah, that's my take on temporary learning solutions.
Thank you. Payman, do you have some thoughts on the local partners question for us?
Yeah, sure. So one of the biggest challenges that basically local partners themselves faced during this pandemic was about the staff well-being for them. So in a very, very short notice, they had to go to the community, deliver the services, and due to lack of unrestricted funding or core funding or like staff well-being fundings, they couldn't provide PPE for their staff. And we had a few incidents that two of our local partners staff, they all got COVID and they couldn't deliver services anymore. So we had to stop the program for a few weeks because of that. So it was like one of the biggest challenges that they basically mentioned to us many times when we were like doing projects with other fundings, and we did a lot of effort to provide them with PPE after that, and even like during that time. And the other problem was, which is not a problem, it could be a problem or not, about communication with communities again, because most of the staff or local partners, they're living in that community. So when they are out there to deliver a message, it is a bit sensitive for the community to receive the message from them. Sometimes during COVID, it was like very sensitive for them. So they had to form and shape the message in a way that it's not coming from a person who is not part of the community. If you go to a community and say that, hey, there is this virus coming, and they would have like different perceptions of this virus. So you have to be an example of like the things that you're telling them. Wearing a mask in your personal life, you have to do that, like because they see you outside of your mission, that you're going somewhere and you don't wear a mask, for example. So there were like some of these problems, but during the time we started to solve these, or at least address these problems.
Thanks so much, Payman. We have another 10, 12 minutes, so please do keep questions coming. I've got a couple here which I'll bundle together, and really encouraging panelists to be reflective, and then we'll see other questions come. But then we might finish with some more sort of looking into the future thoughts, just sort of reflectively. Wondering to what extent, if we look back now, the COVID crisis has developed in a way that perhaps Street Child panelists might have anticipated when this appeal was first launched in March. Related to that, with the benefit of hindsight, other things that would have been done differently by Street Child. And more positively, I'd love each panelist just to call out really clearly one thing that has most excited them about Street Child's COVID response so far.
I'm happy to kick off. So, especially as in my position as head of Africa programs, we might have expected the health crisis to be a lot worse in Africa than it has been, and it's been a fact that we're thankful, really, that it hasn't developed as it could have done and become a real health crisis that completely shut down health systems in Africa. Of course, that's no guarantee against the future. No one really knows why, and I certainly won't try and speculate on why that has been the case, although many are. There's little evidence about why that's the case. So, you don't want to preempt the fact that COVID-19 is clearly still amongst us and still growing globally. But what has borne out my expectations is that the true impact of COVID-19 in Africa would be the economic impact, the lockdowns, the shutdowns, and African governments have had horrendous decisions to have to make between a rock and a hard place, between preventing a health crisis that could overwhelm the country and preventing an economic crisis that could see everybody suffer and millions more potentially than even might catch the virus. So we are already seeing evidence of that economic impact. We're already seeing businesses that have been invested in and their resilience built struggle to cope with the complete shutdown of markets. We're seeing families go hungry that previously were not even below the poverty line. So I fear for the future, in terms of how things will develop going forward, that the economic impact will have a severe lag, and that a lot of that is yet still to come. Another question was about what we might have done differently in the last 6 months. And here, I really think focusing our attentions in the early phase on prevention was the right thing to do. It gave us reach, it gave us impetus and momentum to get out there amongst the communities, be present, and in many cases physically present where we could, and to expand our partner network. And that's something that really excited me about our COVID-19 response. But we have this question, which we all debated a lot. When do we switch to the humanitarian impact that we're seeing? When do we, do we distribute food? Do we start doing some of these this work that meets the most basic needs? And where do we target our attentions? And I think that balance is always really difficult to strike, because you see the needs vary so much in different contexts, and also the situations evolve so fast. So I think we were right to focus on prevention in the first instance, but I'm really glad now that we've pivoted towards the basic needs, particularly education, protection, and livelihoods, that I think what it really boils down to is working with those most marginalised groups and going where only Street Child and its partners can go in some cases to meet those emerging needs. So hard to strike a balance during a crisis when everyone's got COVID on the mind, but very glad we've pivoted towards those basic needs now.
Yeah, Megan, thank you. Payman, to add?
I was going to let Payman go first, or next.
Thanks, Pete. Just going to add one thing about like our program, like maybe in other operations that was the same case. We humanitarians, usually when we go to a community, we are perceived as strangers who don't have the problem that the community is facing. And we haven't been like, when like someone goes there, most of the time that person hasn't been displaced in his or her life, maybe. Some of them, they have had that experience. For COVID-19, that was like one of the first times, I guess, that like humanitarians were facing the same problem as the communities that they were dealing with. So there was this feeling of, hey, I know what you're going through because I'm going through the same thing. So I think that kind of enhanced the community engagement and the relationship between humanitarian sector and communities on the ground. So that was like a very exciting point for me during this like last 6 months. I don't know if I'm right to be excited about that, but that was like something that that was like one of those moments I was like, actually this is new. So yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Pete?
Yeah, I think look, guys, I'm still quite new to Street Child. Joined back at the beginning of March, having been a friend of Street Child for many years in various different ways, but joining as an employee. And I think what's really struck me from the inside is the desire to make a difference that is just so at the heart of Street Child, that sort of drives everything that we do, and and the desire to be innovative in how we do that, and not to be bound by oh well, you're this sort of charity, but actually to say, look, what is most important, what is going to have the biggest impact on vulnerable children and their families, and then to do everything in our power to get the support to them. I've really enjoyed that, seeing the expansion of our local partners that we work with. I think in the beginning of the year, we were working with something like 40. It has gone up well in excess of 50. And I think that's just a really healthy thing. And I want to see those partnership networks go even more. But probably the thing I'm most pleased about is, and I didn't want to, we couldn't share names for obviously protection reasons of confidentiality. But when I hear that kind of story that I shared about the young Musahar girl, and the average age of marriage in that community is only 14 for girls. So we're talking about a girl younger than that, able to advocate for herself and reach out and get help in a safe way. That just reminds me, we're talking about individuals here, individual lives, individual stories. The big numbers, you can kind of lose sight of that. And for me, that reinforces the value, the importance of what we're a small part of helping, frankly, change the world for the better.
Yeah, thanks so much. Okay. So the final set of questions now, and like we're gonna run just a couple minutes over here, I reckon. Hope that's okay, people. We're going to look forward, and three questions here. What do you see as the biggest priorities going forwards? You have all hinted at this so far, so let's just clarify. And then, yeah, this question is really broadly put. What are the main funding needs for the next 3 to 6 months, which is related. There's a more nuanced question here, which I'll give an initial response to, which is where do you stand funding wise, and how do you see the next 6 months finance wise? More of a sort of a kind of landscape question. So I'll respond to that, then throw to the panelists, and this will be your last chance to talk. So please, speak now or forever hold your peace for final comments. Street Child was fortunate to enter the COVID crisis in, frankly, its most robust financial position at any stage, driven by a couple of factors. We have been working on strengthening the financial base of the organisation over the last couple of years. The merger and acquisition work that we've done has contributed to that as well. And then many of you on this call, I know, were very generous to us in our autumn and Christmas appeal, which was matched by DFID this time last year. So, frankly, there are different times when if this crisis had struck, we would have been in a very weak position. Obviously, looking from March onwards, we actually as Street Child, we first experienced COVID as a fundraising crisis, because before we really realised that COVID was going to be so dangerous in Africa and in South Asia, we knew that it was going to wreak havoc in the West and our own fundraising. So we've made adaptations, significant adaptations to our core cost base, and at all times we've worked with two focuses. We knew we had to get extra support to the ground, and so we've structured so that we could allow our supporters who gave money for that to flow basically straight through to the crisis, and that is partly related to the financial strength we had going into the crisis, for which again we're just incredibly grateful. People have supported us in the last couple of years, even if you haven't given directly to our crisis fund, the support you've given to us in the last couple of years has got us to this stage where we can be such a strong actor. How do we see the fundraising landscape in the next 6 months? It's so hard to know, and we are going forwards cautiously. We're so aware that many of our supporters and institutions as well are facing huge financial pressures themselves. But we have to speak very openly about the situations of the communities that we exist to serve, and the grave circumstances they are in. And so we are finding a balance between the two. So that's my kind of landscape comment. That's the last substantive comment that I will make. I'll just throw it to Pete, Payman, and Megan now to talk to their particular priorities and funding priorities. Their final comments.
Yeah, I think we've got a piece of work to do, to be quite honest, to actually put some numbers around what we're going to need. But that focus that I talked about of not only adapting existing programming, but also really digging into what else we can do to ensure that children get back into school, and it's sort of a big back to school push, and making sure that those programs we already had in terms of out of school children, that if there are additional costs involved in helping them get access to safe learning, then we know we need to do a piece to cost out what that looks like. That's something that we're planning to embark on over the next 2 months. So there's a little bit of a watch this space in terms of the quantifiables, but those sort of areas, safe return to school, safe access to education for the vulnerable children and communities that we and our partners are working alongside is absolutely big funding need. It's not really just the next 3 months. It's going to be beyond that.
Thanks, Pete. Megan or Payman?
And I will just say, sorry, Tom.
Sure.
We continue to work at the institutional level, to seek and secure funds, for COVID response initiatives. We've just been successful at getting £200,000 from British government to support what we're calling a closing the caste gap initiative. That is building on that Musahar program I described earlier, to enable us to work with 250,000 members of that community in terms of health and hygiene and psychosocial support, and links to protection services. And that's really exciting. And I think, we are, because of the track record that we've established, the name that we've got, the trust that we have from the British government and other institutional actors, we are seen as an important partner in that. But to be honest, that it scratches the surface in terms of what we could do with. So we will continue to seek more opportunities as well.
Yeah, thanks, Pete.
Yeah, happy to come in. So Street Child's priorities between now and Christmas, as I alluded to a bit in my presentation, we need to resume services as best we can, and within the constraints of the pandemic. So back to school, protection services. We were helping hundreds of thousands of children prior to the pandemic, and we still are, but in more limited ways, and yet needs have gone up exponentially. So resuming services is really, really important to me. As well, as I mentioned, shining a light on the issues not being tackled, not being met. So the Almajiri project is just one example, where other actors have, for whatever reason, not come in to provide support. Street Child, as a medium-sized NGO, and anyway, no one NGO can do it all, and we certainly can't, but we can really try and get into the darkest corners, the most unmet needs. And I think that we can continually do that by looking at the situation afresh and reassessing what we think about who is at the greatest need and whose needs are not being met. And I observe that those who have recently become extremely poor or have experienced a shock are the most vulnerable. So those who were never on our radar before, but now in post-COVID have lost their livelihoods, for example, are very vulnerable. So those are I think two key priorities for me. And then when it comes to funding, well, I observed to help us resume services that a lot of the institutional funding we win is contingent on us leveraging in other funding. And yeah, back in March, we had great plans and we're very excited about all the public fundraising events we had for this year. And although we went into it in a good position, like so many other charities, our hopes for bringing in those leverage funders has decreased. And so, one of my biggest fears is that support decreases during COVID-19, and I really hope and look forward to, for example, in the Mustahar program, the Afghanistan program, and the DRC program, there remain large funding needs in those programs just to continue the services that we already promised the communities, where funding prospects are no longer looking as bright. So that, for me, has to be the top funding priority. But I do note as well that there are opportunities for, as I say, these issues not being tackled, these new initiatives, that we're also looking for seed funding, because quite often how it works, say in a project like Al-Majiri, we'll start with a relatively small project, and then we'll be able to leverage in institutional funding, larger funding sources, government funding potentially in the case of Nigeria, once we've been able to prove concept. And those opportunities are still out there. So those are my two funding priorities for the next 6 months.
Thanks, Megan. Payman, you get a last word.
Yeah, just like a very quick, as Megan and Pete said, getting children back to school in a protected, safe, semi-normal situation. Just imagine you're a child at the age of 7 or 8, and it's like your first year of schooling, and that's like basically what you're facing. I think we need to provide a situation for children in schools to have at least semi-normal education and be able to socialize with other people in a very, very protected way. So yeah, I think that would be like the first thing, to provide protected, safe schooling for children.
It's a fantastic note to end on, Payman. Thank you so much. Yeah, I can't help but to look back to 5 or so years ago when we were reopening schools in Sierra Leone and Liberia after Ebola, and I remember the vast amount of work we had to do to reassure communities that it was safe for their children to go to school. We had to demonstrate that hand washing facilities were there, and that schools had plans for managing the health and safety of children there. Secondly, I remember the children who were on the edges of school suddenly weren't there, and we had to do a massive piece of work to shore those children up, to find them. The children who were 3 or 4 days a week in school or would turn up without a uniform, those were the children who just didn't come back when school reopened. And then thirdly, as well, all the speakers alluded to, before COVID, Street Child was working to help tens of thousands of children who have never been to school or should be in school and have dropped out back into school. And that work remains so vital. And we need to keep that on track as well. So, we've got to walk down the street, chew gum, and skip on a rope at the same time. And we will try. Street Child is guilty of trying, if nothing else. And we're just so grateful to our supporters for everything they enable us to do. And for those of you who pushed out 70 minutes on this lunchtime webinar, I am especially grateful. And we're now going to draw it to a close. And thank you so much. Stay in touch. We have published a report today on the last 6 months of our COVID work. And we are regularly publishing on the blog and through the social media, the updates. And we will be finding lots of opportunities to keep in touch with you over the autumn. There is another of these events in 10 or 11 days' time in aid of in marking the International Day of the Girl Child, with fantastic presentations. Megan is leading the session from female leaders in Street Child's workforce. So yeah, stay engaged, and thank you so much for your support. We're just so grateful. Thank you. To panelists especially.